Yeah, I would like to do it something like 20 minutes so that there is time for Q&A. I'm interested in that, so I will do my best to be pretty fast.
Okay. Okay, so should we start?
Yes.
Okay. Guys, welcome to our English session and thanks for joining us, at least via Zoom. Yeah, I would like to meet you in person, but unfortunately due to pandemic situation, it is rather very, very difficult. So I hope one day we will meet in person. Okay, let's get back to the business. And the first talk is from Louis. Sorry, I don't know how to correctly pronounce your surname. Okay, Vervoort. So the title is Epistemic Relativism and the Gettier Problem, Insights from Philosophy of Science. Please.
Thank you, Lev, and nice to meet you online, all of you. So let me immediately share my screen and show my slides. Can you all see this?
I can see.
Okay, good. So I am based in Tumen. Just one word of background information if you're interested. I'm here since 2017, beginning of the foundation of the school. It's a school and a research institute which is modeled after a liberal arts college of the US. And one specificity is that we try to do interdisciplinary research. I'm more particularly working in a team working on free will, consciousness, and determinism. So from the angle of philosophy, computer science, and physics, neuroscience we would like to do, but until now we did very little in that field. But I've always standing interest for epistemology. So today I will speak about Gettier's problem. I think, put this in the framework of the debate between relativism and absolutism. As you know, in many fields of philosophy, this tension exists, for instance, in philosophy of language, ethics, and in epistemology. In epistemology, the most famous, let's say, relativistic, or the most studied probably at the moment is contextualism. And this is called contextualism because it takes as an essential reference for knowledge, or rather for knowledge attributions, a conversational context. And famous names here are Lewis, Cohen, D. Rose, Rizu, and others. I would like to make a point here that actually there is an advantage in taking as essential reference what I would call a set of hypotheses or a thesis, or if you prefer, a coherent body of information or a perspective. I think that theory and coherent set of hypotheses is probably the most precise relativizing a parameter. Excuse me a second. Yes, I think there is an interesting link to make also with a position in the philosophy of science, which is called epistemic scientific perspectivism. Excuse me, I have a little problem here with my Zoom. I'm going to try to solve that. So I think that this epistemic relativism about which I will talk today is related to what could be called, or what is called, scientific perspectivism, but I will not say much about that today. Still the presentation is visible to everyone? Giacomo?
Yes, yes.
Good.
Yeah.
So let me immediately give you an example in which it seems that concepts as to know and true have a relativistic implicit meaning. And I think that is the clearest in social, but also in natural science. Take, for instance, the example of two psychologists, call them Carl and Anna, and they're discussing prehistoric cave paintings. And suppose that one of them is a fan of Jung, Carl, and Anna is not at all in favor of Jung's views on prehistoric cave paintings. And suppose that Carl suddenly says, archetypes play an essential role in prehistoric art, but would Brian know that? So that's, for most people, a pretty strange question, and certainly it is to Anna, because people who are aware of Jung's theory and who believe that archetypes play an essential role in prehistoric art, they may be convinced of that, and so that for them, knowledge is related to this assumption. So can one really know that Jung's archetypes play an essential role in prehistoric art? Well, that typically depends on whether it is true that Jung's archetypes play an essential role in prehistoric art. So on usual interpretations, one cannot know a proposition that is false. And whether this proposition, PA, is true is certainly a matter of debate among the experts, psychologists, and anthropologists. So this is a bit a strange question, but a possible answer that Anna, for instance, could give is, well, Brian knows that this proposition is true if one assumes the validity of Jung's anthropological theory, which I will call TA. So in a shorter way, Brian knows that PA within TA. Or you could formalize it by saying, by relativizing explicitly this word knowledge or to know to TA and write it in the following way here. Brian knows TA within, Brian knows PA within TA. This is strange, this sounds contrived, but in certain contexts it is necessary, I believe, for clarity, and I will give you several other examples, a little bit less contrived ones. And maybe the case I'm best familiar with is in scientific context when the truth of theories is highly debated. And for instance, in physics, you have often competing frameworks, competing theories, and it is not yet clear which one is the correct one, which is the best one. Suppose, for instance, that you have a theory which predicts that a certain parameter, t, is equal to a certain number, while a second theory predicts that the same parameter, for instance, this could be the superconducting transition temperature. That's something I worked on before. So this is a very vivid, let's say, case for me. Another theory could predict that the same parameter is another number. Okay, these numbers are expressed here in degrees Kelvin. So in certain contexts, it is ambiguous to say that it is true that this parameter t is equal to, for instance, 1 Kelvin or minus 200 degrees Celsius. And it is equally ambitious to say it is true that the temperature is another number because it's debated. No one really knows yet, assuming that the experiment has not yet been done because it is extremely difficult to do it. So to say something like it is true that this parameter is equal to some certain value is very ambiguous. But what is certainly a possible precise way of talking is to say within theory 1, meaning while assuming the validity of theory 1, it is true that a certain proposition is true. For instance, it is true that the transition temperature is equal to 1 Kelvin. So you could, again, formalize this in the following way as I've written here in blue. So the only thing I need for the subsequent discussion is that it is a frequent language practice in a scientific community, but also actually in the philosophical community, to say something as P is true within a certain theory or within a certain set of hypotheses, instead of P is true simplicity. And of course, this is in context with a special epistemic standard is needed. Other examples are, for instance, on Lewis's account, a counterfactual C is true at the world W if the consequent is true in the possible world most similar to we in which the antecedent is true. So here you see a similar phrasing on Lewis's account. Other example, within the ideal gas model, molecular collisions are elastic. Within a more precise theory, this is actually not true. Or the measured chemical equilibrium constant is K, assumed that one can neglect temperature effects. So this phrase here, this statement about the chemical equilibrium is wrong if you are reasoning within a different theory or within different assumptions. So you can abbreviate all of this by saying something like P is true within T, where T is a set of hypotheses or a theory. And I think that this relativity of true carries over to the concept of to know, and even to the concept of being justified. Here is an example where, you know, the relativity of justification, I think, becomes clear. Suppose that PC is a proposition from classical mechanics, such as the kinetic energy of this object is E. Suppose that a calculation using the relevant knowledge of classical mechanics confirms or shows that this statement is true. So you can really calculate within this theory that the kinetic energy is E. Well, a first thing you can remark is that in general, PC is not true within a theory such as relativistic mechanics. So within this theory, you should calculate a slightly different value of the energy. So in other words, within the theory, this phrase is not true. Both are coexisting theories. And by the way, classical mechanics is still used on a daily basis by very many people. Other people use relativistic mechanics to have more precise predictions. So suppose that two physicists, Alice and Bob, are discussing the calculations of their colleague Cecil, who just submitted to Bob the result PC. The kinetic energy of this object is E. If Bob would ask Alice, is it true that PC? Alice, who might be using two theories, some day one theory, another day the other, she might find this question ambiguous, and she might say, well, PC is true within classical mechanics. And in this case, she would be right. Bob may continue his slightly ambiguous questions by asking, am I justified to believe that PC is true? Alice, who is a precise, who prefers precise language, says, well, you're justified to believe that PC if you assume the validity of classical mechanics, or shorter, you're justified to believe PC within classical mechanics. So here you see that this relativistic language practice actually also applies in specific context to the concept of justification. And same thing, as you can imagine, for no, but I've given you examples. This example again leads to this insight that to be precise, you should say Cecil knows relative to TC that PC. So all I've done right now is to give you some linguistic hints that under certain conditions, it seems that true, no, and justified should be relativized to a certain sets of hypotheses or theories, or if you prefer, contextual frameworks or perspectives. And even actually in a very everyday context, this is in principle, and I think that all skeptics will especially agree here easily. Suppose that we're looking at an everyday context where two people, Anne and Bill, are visiting Cyrus, and suppose that Cyrus is an illusionist and a notorious fan of sophisticated holographic imaging techniques. Bill is not really aware of that, and suddenly he sees a crocodile while they're waiting for Cyrus in his in the entrance of his house, suddenly he sees a crocodile entering the room and he shouts, "My God, there's a crocodile." Well, Anne, she says, well, yeah, that's true if assuming that everything is normal here. In other words, assuming that, the usual assumptions can be made in order that indicates that everything is normal. So here is, in principle, even in everyday circumstances, I think that there is an in principle reference to certain assumptions. By the way, this also links quite nicely to Hume's, to Quine's holism. I might say something more about that. Now let us apply this to Gettier's problem. As you know, Gettier criticizes or gives counterexamples to Plato's theory of what knowledge is, and famously, Plato has analyzed the phrase "a subject S knows that P if and only if P is true, S believes that P, and S is justified in believing that P." So let me call that proposition P1. That's Plato. And we all know the Gettier counter examples, which involve a certain Smith who has certain information by which he is justified to believe that not he, but his friend Jones will get the job for which they are both applying, and that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket, but by chance, actually, or it so happens that it is not Smith, but he himself, Jones, who gets the job. The boss changes his opinion, and by accident, he also has 10 points in his pocket. So in this case, actually, the three right-hand sides conditions are all justified, but Gettier says, and still, Smith does not really know that he gets the job and that he has 10 coins in his pocket. We all know this example, so I'll be very quick here. According to this relativized language practice, I propose that we should actually replace know, true, and justification by relativized expressions. In most general case, you can here write T1, T2, and T3. In principle, they should not be all the same, these relativistic frameworks, but to make sense of the expression, it becomes very quickly clear that they all should be the same. So we should take here in this expression T1 equals to T2 equals to T3, else our Platonic rephrasing cannot give a clear sense. So I will call this condition here T1 equals to T2 equals T3 as the condition of consistent referencing. And actually this has a clear meaning, but if we take all frameworks equal, then it simply means that the subject knows that P within a set of hypotheses or within a theory T1, let's call it T1, if and only if he believes that P and P is true within that same T1, and as is within T1 justified to believe P. The essential point, or the way I understand Gettier's analysis, is that it does not justify this rewritten Platonic analysis. In particular, it does not satisfy the condition T1 equals T2, T3. And more precisely, in Gettier's counterexamples, T1 is not equal to T3. So this condition of consistent referencing says that one can only compare knowledge within a certain perspective T1 to justify true belief within that same T1. Meaning, if you explain knowledge by referring to other concepts, well, and if knowledge is relative, you should relativize also the other concepts to the same relativizing parameter. So in Gettier's counterexamples, to know is actually to really know, meaning that T1, or the relativizing framework for knowledge, is some kind of absolute theory. You know, this is Platonic knowledge, the absolute theory of the ideas, the absolute ideas. In science, people also like this concept of, the ultimate theory. And it is actually a very, I think, everyday belief that such a thing exists. So T1 is the best possible theory or the best possible information set at hand. That's a little bit less ambitious. And in Smith's case, the best possible information is the information that is at hand after the job is attributed, when one indeed really can know who got the job. Okay? But T3, the justification of Gettier examples, is only justification within a truncated information set T3. Smith was justified to believe that Jones would get the job based on preliminary information, T3, namely that the boss told him, but then the boss afterward changed his opinion. So information that turned out to be inadequate at a later moment. So T3 is in any case not the same information or set of hypotheses T1. T1 is a revised and improved body of information with respect of T3. You would write that T1 is more powerful than T3. In any case, T1 is not equal to T3. So that's my explanation of where Gettier's problems come from. They seem to be based on a shift in the reference or perspective, or if you prefer, set of hypotheses which assume the role of the theory in a daily speech. In daily speech, we do not think that our utterances are relative to a theory. It's more natural to say that we might implicitly refer them to a set of hypotheses. But that's ultimately the same thing. So clearly, explicit referencing towards a theory or information set is usually in daily practice not necessary. It's redundant because the usual people use the same assumptions. On the view that I'm exploring here, one could say that explicit referencing is often unnecessary because in a non-ambiguous context, the background theory or assumptions are broadly shared by all people in a discussion. It is the body of information that is available to common sense, or that is shared by people engaging in usual or normal discussion, a discussion that is not in need of special epistemic standards or precautions. Actually, it's very easy to link this to Zagzebski's famous analysis of Gettier. She says that you will always have Gettier cases if there is a kind of independence between knowledge and justification. For instance, she says the notion of justification or warrant is less stringent than knowledge, requiring only that the right path is one that is usually successful at getting the truth. It is this difference between the notion of knowledge and the notion of justification that is responsible for Gettier problems. She also says you will always have Gettier objections as long as there is a small degree of independence between truth and the other conditions of knowledge. So I think this is very easily, you can express this in the framework I just mentioned, as long as the set of hypotheses T1 is not exactly the same as the set of hypotheses T3, and actually also as T2, you get into trouble, you get your problems. It would also be interesting to compare it to contextualism and to Quine's epistemic holism. Let me not speak about contextualism, but maybe you can ask questions about it. Quine has famously argued that propositions cannot be verified or tested individually by direct empirical observation. What one tests or verifies is a whole web of hypotheses, a whole theory, one could say. And I think that you can make a case that this points again to the relativity of truth of sentences to a set of hypotheses or a theory. Let me conclude. So I've suggested an explanation of where Gettier's problems come from. They seem to be based on a shift in the reference or perspective, more precisely the set of hypotheses or a theory. And this perspective of language practice is ubiquitous in natural and social science. If we can learn something from that, then I would claim that the concept of truth, knowledge, and justification seem to have an implicit relativity or reference. And if one wishes to relate these concepts to each other, one should consistently reference for clarity of speech, for disambiguation. I think that it would be interesting to compare it to Quine's holism, to contextualism, in which the contextualism, the referent is an is a context, not a theory, but that's not that precise because in certain contexts, two theories might be, the distinguishing factor whether a phrase is true or not true. So I think that this model here, this account is more precise. And I thank you very much for your attention. Let me use the opportunity that we, Giacomo, and our colleagues in Tumen, we invite you heartily to come and visit us, and let's organize something together in Tumen. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Yes, thank you, Louis. And as I can see, we have 8 minutes for Q&A. And actually, Martin wants to ask a question. Please, Martin.
Yes. Can you hear me, see me?
Yeah, perfectly. Nice to meet you.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Luis. Very interesting. So I was just wondering, about the framework. So on one side.
Excuse me, Martin, there are two people speaking at the same time. So I think there is someone who should mute his microphone, else I cannot really well hear Martin. Please again, Martin.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Now it's perfect.
Okay, good. So this is like a basic question about the framework, right? So on one side, you talk about consistent referencing, which kind of gives us to the extension level. But sometimes you talk about meanings and truth and stuff like that, which kind of create intentional level. So,
Excuse me.
So, do you differentiate between extensionality and intentionality here, or?
Intentionality, that means, is that the meaning or is...
Yes, like go back to Frege, right? We've got reference, we've got meanings, like two levels of kind of how language works, right? Yeah. So if you have this kind of structural property of your framework, or you don't care at all?
No, I think it is really all about the meaning. I think, just as Quine actually, that phrases get their meaning without a whole web of theories, or at least within one theory. Lev, I think you should mute your microphone, because else we always hear you. Lev, can you...
Okay, what about now?
Yeah. So
sorry.
Yeah, Lev. If you speak, then please mute your phone, your microphone, because else we cannot communicate with the other people. So Martin, to answer, do I answer your question by saying that when I write this little formalistic thing, it is really a notation to refer to the meaning of the phrase. The meaning of the phrase is relative, finds its meaning within a set of hypotheses, or a theory, or a perspective. Is that answering the question? Or please repeat, because I couldn't hear very well your question.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, like proper name, it's a reference, right? I refer to something which like really exists. That's one thing. And then we've got meaning, like, morning star, evening star. We've got the same reference, but different meanings. And now if your framework kind of reflects this distinction between reference and meaning, right?
No, it's all about meaning. When you have a somewhat complex phrase, there is no direct pointing to a referent going on. There is really the goal is really to convey meaning, and such a meaning is not something which is a simple pointing to an object. That is a simple form of giving meaning. But here we are talking about utterances within a context which has a certain epistemic complexity, We are not. So it is it's a very interesting question. Actually, you could say that a phrase such as "that person is Martin," is it also, that's a simple case. But even I would say that even such a phrase is still, there are still some assumptions. If you're extremely precise, that makes the assumption that it is really Martin we are pointing at, and it is not a holographic image of Martin. Obviously, here, most people, and in most contexts, you do not need to be aware of these hidden assumptions, right? Because they're obvious and they're everyday. Most people are not skeptics, so they would gladly assume that, this is some kind of an absolute truth, but I'm not a big fan of absolute truths. I think that as soon as you begin to believe in absolute truths, even in simple cases, you run into problems.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, so any other questions, please?
Thank you for your talk, Louis.
Thank you.
And one of your conclusions was that no, truth, and justified have a relative reference, right?
Right.
So, yeah. So could you please clarify how this formulation is different from telling that no, true, or justified are context sensitive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. And it is a very closely related position, okay? Except that, in certain contexts, yes, I agree that the truth and the justification and knowing something, so knowledge phrases, they are relative to context, but I think it is a little bit more precise to say that not only to context, but more precisely to sets of hypotheses. Why? Because in certain contexts, okay, in the same context, for instance, two psychologists discussing cave paintings and the meaning of these paintings, that's the same context, still saying something like Jung's theory is very important to understand cave paintings, or saying something like archetypes are very important to understand cave paintings. Well, that's only true within Jung's theory. So within one context, someone else could say, well, no, I think that archetypes are not important at all to understand cave paintings. So the same phrase within the same context, namely two psychologists or anthropologists talking about cave paintings, could have a different truth value depending on the set of hypotheses you assume, you accept. You see, so I think it is more precise, or it's useful to specify the context by specifying the hypothesis you're using in the context. Is that answering your question, Nikolai?
Yeah, it's kind of answering.
Yeah. I have to admit, it would be interesting to look at it in more detail, okay? I'm now submitting this paper, and typically, well, the first referee asked me to stipulate in more detail what is the difference with contextualism. So I'm working on that. I think it is doable.
Okay, thank you. So it's time for the next talk. The next talk is from Nikolai Shurakov, University of Tartu, Epistemic Contextualism and Experimental Philosophy. Please, Nikolai.
Hi, are you able to see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. and hear me well, I suppose. So, yeah, I'm Nikolai. I'm graduate student at University of Tartu in Estonia, and my today presentation is about contextualism. So it is quite related to the previous presentation. Here is a structure. Oh. Yeah. Okay. In the first part of my talk, I will provide an evidence of connection between experimental philosophy and contextualism, after sketching what I understand or what I treat in this presentation as epistemic contextualism, or just EC, to be not to be repetitive. When I provide some historical reasons why we can or should connect epistemic contextualism and experimental philosophy, aka XP, when I will overview, as I stated in my abstract, several experiments and their results, also paying attention to a methodological shift and results of this shift, because it's kind of changed the game in this debate. And just to begin with, yeah, here are a couple of contextualists, and just what all of them have in common is an idea that no is context sensitive, and the more important figures in this debate are obviously De Roos, Kogan, and lately Ichikawa. And to illustrate this idea, I suggest to briefly have a look at the bank case of De Roos, because I am going to refer to it several times. So imagine that De Roos and his wife are driving home on a Friday afternoon, and they plan to stop. They plan to stop at the bank on the way home to deposit their paychecks. But as we drive past the bank, we notice that the lines inside are very long, and as they often are on Friday afternoons. Although we generally like to deposit our paychecks as soon as possible, it's not especially important in this case. It is my emphasis. But this money should be deposited right away. So De Roos suggests that they drive straight home and deposit their paychecks on Saturday morning. His wife says maybe the bank won't be open tomorrow. Lots of banks are closed on Saturdays. And he replies that no, I know it will be open. I was just there 2 weeks ago on Saturday. It's open until noon. So in this case, he seems to know that the bank is open on Saturday. In another case, it's almost the same story, but it is of paramount importance that checks to be bounced as soon as possible. Otherwise, they will be in a very bad situation. So in the same conversation with his wife, she could mention that banks do change their hours. And to the same question, do you know the banks will be open tomorrow? Remaining as confident as De Roos was in the previous case, he still can reply like, no, I don't know. I'd better go in and make it sure. So this well-known argument has many instances. Another case is Thelma, Louise, and Elena, or the airport case from Kogan. So all these cases aim to demonstrate how credible is to attribute knowledge in a low stakes context, and how we tend to deny it in a when stakes are higher. And of course, there are variation between these low and high situations. Some people tend to explain it with bets, stakes, importance, or interests. So it is what I treat as contextualism here. And now a little throwback to the history, and it is from De Rose's article from 2005, where he tells a story of his conversation with a supervisor, with advisor Roger Albritton. So Albritton says nobody would really talk that way when De Rose demonstrated his original cases. So De Rose tells it doesn't matter whether people would talk that way. All I need is that such a claim would be true. And that certainly is my intuition about the truth value of the claim. So his advisor noticed that, look, if you are going to do ordinary language philosophy, and that's what are you doing here, you'd better do it right. So the changes did not only make the argument read more nicely, which was the only payoff De Rose was expecting, but actually it made it more compelling. So in this sense, it was very useful for De Rose to agree that what he's doing is ordinary language philosophy, or it is in this spirit. Another claim is that let's have a quick look at how people from experimental philosophy treat ordinary language philosophers. An example of John Langshaw Austin, who is regarded as having an especially acute ear for fine distinctions of meaning overlooked by other philosophers. Austin employs an informal experimental approach to gathering evidence in support of these fine distinctions in meaning, an approach that has become a standard technique for investigating meaning in both philosophy and linguistics. So Austin is admitted to have some experimental nature in his research by people who actually do experimental philosophy. Therefore, it's, if we admit that EC at its roots has indeed ordinary language philosophy, then it's even easier to bridge contextualism and the experimental philosophy. So I think it equips us with a historical consideration that supports this interaction. And now we are going to this very interaction. So there were several experiments on context sensitivity even before Buckwalter, but it was someone, the first people who conducted an experiment paying special attention to bank cases, and his article from 2010 claims that knowledge isn't closed on Saturdays. So it's obviously in his research interests, but he's dealing with epistemic contextualism. So he asked subjects to perform the following task with regard to versions of the bank scenario, in which uses of I know the bank will be open on Saturday are evaluated in low stakes or high stakes contexts, and separately context with or without mentioned possibilities of error. And here, on the scale of 1 to 5, circle how much you agree or disagree that assertion I know the bank will be open on Saturday is true. And here's an example of scale. And here's results he got. So here Buckwalter doesn't get a significant difference between low-high cases, as you can see here. I hope that it is not a big difference, and what is more important, it is not statistically significant. With always like p 0.5. So the study showed no significant effect either of stakes or the silence of error possibilities. Instead, subjects in all three conditions showed a tendency to agree with self-ascription of knowledge was true. And immediately he got a criticism from De Rose that De Rose's version of contextualism makes no assumption on which of those two factors, high stakes or possibility of error results, is responsible for the shift of truth value. So De Rose was roughly telling that what you tested is not a theory I defend. However, a bit later, Shafarov, who examined several experiments done in experimental philosophy, came to very unpleasant conclusion that the existing debate over contextualism is based in large part on claims about what ordinary speakers will say about bun cases, but these claims do not survive empirical scrutiny. Ordinary speakers do not say what philosophers say they will say. At this point, it was quite surprising that contextualism got no support from experiments. However, Hansen and Schemler argued that what Bulkwalker actually did is what he got a null result. Bulkwalker did not find a statistically significant difference between evaluation of I know the bank is open Saturday in high and low stakes, but it is a null results, and null results are generally considered to be inconclusive, rather than as showing that two variables are unrelated. And here's a picture of journal that's aimed to publish null results. So Hansen and Schemler suggested a shift in methodology, and they conducted their own experiment. Here's a response scale that has been changed from 1 to 5 to a percentage scale from 0 to 100, and here you can see 5% and 75%. And the results we got really demonstrate a difference between low stakes and high stakes cases. So here are a couple of their conclusions. The first is that we found clear contextual effect across all the types of scenarios tested: knowledge, color, and miscellaneous. In addition to knowledge, we also tried to look at context sensitivity of color, and we tried several scenarios on top of knowledge, and this resulted in a surprising discovery that we uncovered previously unnoticed distinctions between types of scenarios of interest to contextualism. The contextual effects were weaker for knowledge scenarios than for color and miscellaneous scenarios, and the contextual effect for knowledge scenarios, but not for color miscellaneous scenarios, disappeared when only the first block of responses was considered, where it is not plausible that there were contrast effects. So in a way, Hansen and Schemler confirmed contextualist hypotheses. However, the difference was not as it was predicted by contextualists. So it even turned back Walter in his later publication, where he said that the clear upshot is not only has contextualism been shown to be compatible with relevant knowledge behaviors, but also that such empirical evidence can be used to forge more detailed versions that specify with greater accuracy the relevant linguistic model claimed for the word know. And finally, another experiment has been conducted by Thury, who was not only interested in the bank case, but also tried to replicate the results using the airport case. In this case, a couple is going to see a game, basketball, if they come in time to Chicago, or ice hockey if they are late. In a high-stakes scenario, they deliver an organ for transportation, and it is of paramount importance to have a direct flight to Chicago. So it's better to double-check the schedule. However, conclusion of jury is a bit different. So he argues that contextualists correctly predicted that people will agree when someone says, I know, in a low-stakes situation, and when someone says, I don't know, in a related high-stakes situation. But some contextualists have insisted that when testing their views, it is critical to include explicit utterances of I know and I don't know, because this is a significant part of what behind the intuitions actually contextualists appeal to. However, they fail to realize that this difference alone is enough to produce a relevant pattern of agreement with knowledge statements. So it is a feature of claims I know and I don't know without big attention to, but we can get the same results just using these phrases like I know and I don't know. So people would treat one as true in a low context and another is true in a high context. So for discussions hinging on patterns in ordinary usage, philosophers should be quick to rely on controlled experiments to separate wheat from chaff. This is especially true early in a research program when experimental results can provide formative clues, putting researchers on a more promising paths. So theory suggests a bit shift in methodology, in philosophical methodology, with philosophical claims are to be tested at the earlier stage. And here are a few concluding remarks from my presentation. I hope that I made it clear that there is a historical connection between epistemic contextualism and experimental philosophy. And when tested, the predictions of EC get some support from experimental data. However, these results are less significant to compare with non-knowledge scenarios, like with color scenarios, or with other context-sensitive expressions. It is if we think about context-sensitive adjectives or especially indexicals like I, now, or here. And the final note is that XP, experimental philosophy, seems to become a new great power in philosophical debates. It may rule out some theoretical claims and support the other. Debates regarding the context sensitivity of know is a confirmation. So I hope it will a bit promote experimental philosophy among philosophers. So thank you for listening, and here's the time for Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Nikolai. So we have about 12 minutes for Q&A. Please, anyone? Yes, Giacomo?
Yeah, thanks, Nikolai. I didn't know about these experiments. It was very interesting. No, can you maybe just say something more about the Rose reply to Buckwheat, if I'm something like that, sorry, if I'm not mistaken, because you said that the Rose said, look, you're not actually testing my theory. My theory is, I mean, what you're testing is not what my theory says. Could you maybe say something more about that? Like why exactly, according to the Rose, they were not testing, his theory?
Yeah, sure. what Buckwalter did is that he designed his experiment with a block structure, and he tried to make it clear when the stakes are higher. So there was a structure like me and my wife are going home, and it is very important for us to deposit the money today. He constructed cases like this. So there was a case without any mentions of low or high stakes, and another cases were constructed with mention of opportunity to be mistaken in a sense. So when you have just a little evidence, a little piece of evidence, or when your evidence is not definitely enough, such as I've been there 2 weeks ago, or if you just saw that there was a line near the bank 2 weeks ago, it seems not to be enough for knowledge at some, if the stakes are higher. So in the first case, there were no mentions of higher stakes or error possibility. In the second case, it was mentioned that stakes are high or low. And at the third case, it was mentioned that the rows might be mistaken in some sense, but his evidence is not so strong, or there is an opportunity to be mistaken about what he what propositions he self-ascribes to know.
Okay, but then, sorry, if I can have a follow-up, then Buckwalter, so, and that's the name. I mean, I know the Rose theory, but it seems, I mean, the way you are describing it, it seems that Buckwalter was actually testing, you know, if he asked when, you know, in a low stakes situation and in a high stakes situation, it seems to me was testing precisely, you know, whether the intuitions of ordinary people like comply with the Rose theory. And it seems that they didn't, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Buckwalter was kind of sure that what he's doing is actually testing the Rose's hypothesis. And the Rose tried to explain why the results are not as he predicted. So he suggested that high stakes and the error possibility are to be mentioned in the same examples, because Buckwalter tried not to only demonstrate that contextualism is either true or false, but also to identify some factors which contribute to context sensitivity of knowledge. Knowledge might be context sensitive because stakes are high, because there are some higher bets, because there is a difference in interest. So he tested like research error possibility.
Okay, any other questions? Looks like there are no other questions. So thank you so much, Nikolai. And let's continue with the next talk. The next talk is from Giacomo Andreoletti, University of Tumen. And it is entitled Branching Time and Doomsday. Please, Giacomo. Giacomo, could you switch on your mic? It is currently switched off.
Sorry, I always make the same mistake. Let me share the screen again. Okay, so I was saying, yeah, let me thank you for being here and the organizers. I know how difficult it can be to organize an hybrid conference, so thank you. Also, I have to apologize because I will not be talking about knowledge in my talk. My topic will be on the philosophy of time. I actually did my BA thesis in knowledge, but then in philosophy of knowledge and contextualism actually, but then I never did research on that. But I see I'm not the only one not talking about knowledge, so I feel less guilty. Okay. So yeah, just a few words. Yeah, I work like our first speaker, Louis. We are colleagues and we share the office. I work at the School of Advanced Studies, really near Ekaterinburg. We are in Tumen. And okay, so let me start. So we'll be talking about branching time, one of the most popular theories, standard theories in the philosophy of time, and doomsday in the sense of sometimes in the literature people refer to doomsday just as the possibility that time ends, okay? Even though, I mean, in other contexts, the word doomsday might have different meanings. So here's like a short plan of what I'm about to do. So I will talk a little bit about branching time as one of the most standard and used theories of the open future. I will talk about a distinction within branching time between two kinds, let's say, of branching time. So moment-based versus history-based branching time, and I will explain a bit what that is. I will present what I think is a new kind of openness of the future, which I will call present openness with respect to doomsday. And my thesis or my conclusion will be that whereas the first kind of branching time, so moment-based structures, cannot represent or cannot account for this kind of openness, history-based structures can. And again, I try to explain what these things are in the... So, I mean, okay, even I assume most of you, or if not all of you, are familiar with branching time. Just to recap, let's say it's a particular view of time, firstly introduced by Kripke and Pryor and others, where we think of time as a tree that branches. That's the metaphor, right? So the idea is that you have a structure like the one that I'm showing right now, where, but I mean, the idea is that, you know, there are multiple futures, multiple alternative futures where alternative things happen. For instance, you have on this branch, on the history H1, you have some happening, something happens here, some event, I don't know, John eating frozen yogurt, whereas in other branches, other events happen. Okay, so that's a peculiar idea of time, which is usually used to model the idea that the future, unlike the past, is open. Okay, whereas the past is fixed, the future is open and up for grabs. Okay, so branching time is a particularly strong theory to represent the openness of the future. Because notice that if you pick any moment in the branching structure, let's say M3 here, M3 has a unique past. If you go left, right, this is the past of M3. So the past is unique. Each moment has only one past, but possibly a moment has more than one future ahead of itself, right? So there are alternative futures that might happen. And this, I mean, represent the possibilities for different ways the future could be. Now, for people into it, I mean, you might know there are actually several kinds of branching time. You can have branching time in a bitheoretic fashion, in an atheoretic fashion, a la McCall, where you have an objective present and the tree might lose branches as time goes by. You can have the so-called thin red line. And again, without entering into details, just want to say that my argument is intended to apply to all sorts of branching time, at least the ones I know. So some technicalities. I mean, I will just because I will use like just a little bit of temporal logic at some point. It's basically standard. I'm gonna use standard branching time structures and an Occamist semantics. So we have the standard connectives of propositional logic. We have the operator P, about the past operator, which says it was the case in the past that. The future operator will be the case that. And then we have the necessity operator that in this context needs to be understood as temporal necessity, okay? So inevitability, right? Something is necessary if it's inevitable, not inevitable, yeah. Then a branching time model, and this is going to matter, well, normally it's defined as an order triple, like with a set of times, the earlier than relation, and then a function that that assigns truth or falsity to couples of moments and atomic sentence letters, okay? So nothing particularly new here, it's just one standard way to define branching time structures, and then you have this condition at the bottom to impose on the structure that there is no backward branching, that branching goes only toward the future. Okay, okay, one of the concepts that I need for the rest of the talk is the concept of history. In branching time, a history is, let's say, well, intuitively is, let's say, from left to right, from the past to the future, one complete way things could be, okay? For instance, H1 above is one of the histories of the branching, of the whole branching structure. H2 is another history, H3 is another one, and so on. Technically, yeah, they're standardly defined as maximally ordered sets of earlier than related moments, okay? Just one history is it's something complete, and it's one of the many possible developments of the universe, right? Just one of the many. Then, last technical thing, I will just use the Occamist semantic because it's somewhat standard when we talk about branching time, although there are obviously alternatives. But still, I think my point will apply even if someone adopts, for instance, person semantics. Just to remind everyone, what is crucial is that when you have the F operator, well, first of all, in the Occamist semantics, sentences are evaluated at pairs, moment, history, okay, so not at moments simpliciter. And for instance, when you have the future operator, you have to, let's say, go forward in that history and check whether phi is true at some point on that history. Well, likewise for P, just go backward. Whereas when you have the necessity operator, which again in this context means something is inevitable, you don't just check what happens, let's say, on the history of evaluation, but you check throughout all histories that pass through the moment of the evaluation, okay? So that's how box works in the Occamist semantics, okay? Well, okay, last thing before I get to my argument. Now, what I presented is, again, a standard way of defining branching time structures and with semantics like the Occamist semantics, which is usually associated with branching time. And as I was saying at the outline, though, there are at least two possible ways to characterize branching time models. Okay, the first one is the moment-based, so-called moment-based branching structures, where histories are defined in the way I defined them before, just maximally ordered sets of moments which are ordered by the earlier than relation, okay? So just a maximally ordered sets. Whereas alternatively, one could define branching tree models by making use of the so-called history-based branching structures. And what we do is that we add a parameter to the fundamental parameters of the branching structures. So we do not only have the set of times, the earlier than relation, and the interpretation function, but we also, let's say, plug in the model what histories there are, okay? And we make it a fundamental parameter of the model in the second version. Now, there is a debate about, I mean, what we should prefer between moment-based and history-based branching structures. Orstrom and Hasle, in some of their, this comes from their book on temporal logic, but they talk about this also in other papers. They have some arguments to show that we should prefer history-based structures, and because they have some examples where they argue that these examples can be accounted by history-based structures, where moment-based structures cannot. Belknap et al. In their famous Facing the Future book, they reply to the example of Orstrom and Hasle, and they argue that, well, they argue the opposite, that they are fans of moment-based structures, so they have a counter-argument to say that they should be preferred to history-based structure. And more recently, Grandjean and Pascucci, in a recent paper, they have a new argument, a new case, again, this in favor of history-based structures. Now, in the paper, I address these three examples and try to address these arguments. In this talk, I will just skip this part because, I mean, it will take too much time. But it's, I mean, instructive to see how they deal in this debate. So now I will try to get to my point. The first thing I want to note is that when we talk about the openness of the future, the fact that, if we believe so, obviously, that the future is open, there seems to be at least two kinds of openness of the future, okay? And I call them in the paper absolute openness and relative openness. To use basic examples, right? Say that N has never eaten frozen yogurt up to a moment N. In some continuations, in some branches, she does eat frozen yogurt at some point in the future, and in other continuations, in other histories, she never does. So at M, it is open whether she will eat frozen yogurt, okay? And whether is crucial. It's open whether she will do so. In the case of the second case, relative openness, we can think of cases where, for instance, take Bob, who is a big fan of frozen yogurt and can't resist it. It is inevitable, so not open, that Bob will eat frozen yogurt at some point in the future, but it might be open when he will do so, okay? Maybe in 1 day, maybe in 2 days, in 3 days, and so on. So in such a case, although it is inevitable that Bob will eat frozen yogurt, it is open when, instead of whether this will happen. Now, what happens when we introduce the possibility that time ends, right? What I'm calling, other people in the literature call doomsday. Now, as far as we can have like absolute and relative openness with respect to doomsday, and both moment-based and history-based structures can handle this open doomsday scenario well. To do so, we just need an endpoint in a branching structure, where a moment in the structure is simply an endpoint if basically there is no other moment which is later than it. Okay, that's what it means for something to be an endpoint in time. There is no later moment. And following Meyer, and again, it's quite standard, we can say that an endpoint is a moment at which G and this symbol, which stands for a logical falsehood, is true, because G is, it will always be the case that. So it will be this formula will be vacuously true only at the last moment of time. So we can use it to represent the end of time. Now, if we want to model what I'm calling absolute openness, we can do it easily, again, with both structures, independent of whether they're moment-based or history-based. We just need two branches, okay? Let's say in one future, the universe ends at M1, and whereas on the other branch, the universe never ends and continues indefinitely. So it's correct to say that at M, it is possible, but not necessary, that time will end, meaning that it's open whether time will end, okay? If we want to represent relative openness with respect to Doomsday, we can do it like in figure 4, okay? We have two branches stemming from the moment M. In one history, the universe ends at M1. In the other history, the universe ends a bit later at M3. And again, in this case, it is inevitable that Doomsday will come, but it is open when Doomsday will arrive, okay, or when time will end. Formally, I mean, you just have that based on the Occam's semantics, you have that these formulas turn out to be true as desired. For instance, in the case of absolute openness, it is possible that in the future it will be Doomsday, and it is not necessary that in the future it will be Doomsday. For relative openness, Doomsday is necessary, but it is not, it is open when it will happen, okay? You just need to use metric tense operators. Okay. Now, what I'm saying, I think that, I mean, there is, besides what I'm calling absolute and relative openness, when it comes to Doomsday, there might be a new kind of openness, okay? Suppose that just intuitively, okay, there is a specific moment M, okay, and at M, it might be open whether the world, the universe, ends right at M, okay, or instead the universe continues and goes on, okay? So it is that at a specific moment M, the universe might, you know, M might be Doomsday because the universe might end, as a matter of possibility, of an open possibility, might end right at M, or there is also a possibility that the universe continues and goes on, right, with other stuff happening. In such a situation, and if you utter something at the moment, very moment M, seems correct to say this present moment might be Doomsday, okay? It's not certain that it's Doomsday, but it might be, okay? As a matter of possibilities. Now, this is in a sense, obviously a form of temporal openness, right? I mean, that should be pretty obvious, but I argue it's distinct from what I'm calling absolute and relative openness. Because in the case of absolute and relative openness, the openness is completely future-oriented, like in the case of Anne eating frozen yogurt, right? It is open what will happen in the future, right? Whether she will eat frozen yogurt or not. In the example of D, this present moment might be Doomsday. There is obviously a sense according to which the openness of this case is about the future, because we may say, will the war continue or not? But it's definitely regards the present too, okay? Because what is indeterminate or what is open is whether the present moment M is or is not Doomsday. So that's something, some kind of openness with respect to the present. And notice also that usually in a branching time structure, each moment is fully determinate, okay? Normally it will not make sense to say within branching time that it is indeterminate whether Bob eats frozen yogurt at M. Okay, every moment, if you look at it only at one moment, everything that happens there is determinate. In this case, though, if you look at the moment M, it is indeterminate whether M is Doomsday or not. So that's another difference with respect to the other two standard cases. So let's just call it this case present openness. Okay. Now, I also want to add that, I mean, these seems a perfectly legitimate metaphysical possibility, right? Maybe not a physical possibility in our universe, but definitely, like, I mean, I don't see anything strange with thinking that we might have situations where it is not determinate whether at some moment the world ends or continues with other stuff happening. Just seems like a perfectly legitimate possibility. And if it is, then the question is like, how can a branching time represent, model, or account for this possibility? So, or how we can make a claim such as the true within the context of branching time. Now, the first tempting thought is to say, look, we could use absence of future branches to represent the possibility that M has no continuation, right? We might, you know, think about the following structure, or part of a structure, where there is this moment M, and here, let's say above, there is an absence of branches, and then a branch like H1, a history H1 that continues. Now, obviously, this is not going to work because, well, first of all, the point is, if we reason along these lines, you know, and we say that, look, it is a possibility that time ends at M because there is an absent branch, whatever that would mean. This would be true at moments others than M. Actually, at any other moment in the structure, there are absent branches, if such things could exist, that stem from those moments. And we might want to say that in those other moments, it's not the case that Doomsday is a possibility, right? So this is not going to work. What's going to work? Well, in general, branching time models future possibilities by positing multiple existing branches. Here, the problem is that we're trying to say that the possibility that nothing will exist is a possibility, so to say. So it's a bit tricky. The only solution I can think of, but yeah, again, maybe I'm mistaken, is that a branching theory should use something like something that I'm calling broken histories in the paper. Like a broken history is intended to be a set of moments within the branching structure, obviously related by the earlier time relation, that this set has a last moment, which is supposed to be Doomsday, but it also has later moments according to the fundamental earlier than relation. Okay. More precisely, I define a broken at a moment M history, and I use the star to like symbolize it as a subset of T, such that it is the union of M and all the moments earlier than M, and it has upper bounds in the whole set of T, which means moments later than M according to the fundamental earlier than relation in the structure. Now, if you have something like this, and let's say we use the vertical lines to signal, so to say, that their broken history ends, you get the desired results, okay? You can model the possibility that the present moment M is Doomsday, because the moment M in this case belongs both to the history H1, the one that continues, and M belongs as well to the history H star M, the broken history at M. So you get the desired results. At M, at M, it is Doomsday according to the broken history, and it is not Doomsday according to the other history passing through M, which is H1. So you have the desired result. It is possible that it's doomsday, but it is not necessary that it is doomsday. So meaning that, again, it's an open possibility of M. Now, and I'm almost finished, I need only a couple of minutes. Now, my point is that you can model this spatial case of openness that I'm calling present openness only if you use broken histories, okay? Now, the point is that you can use broken histories only if you rely upon history-based branching structures, okay? You need, if you want to use broken histories, you need to give up moment-based structures. Why? Just because, as a matter of definitions, because in moment-based structures, something is a history when it is a maximally ordered set of related moments according to the Ehlers-Danlos relation. And just by definition, a broken at M history cannot be a maximal set because by definition, it has later moments according to the Ehlers-Danlos relation. So what you need to do is to resort to history-based structures where what histories there are in the model is set as a fundamental parameter of the model. Given that it's a fundamental parameter, let's say, you inflate your ontology, but you are at liberty in postulating what histories there are so that you're free to include broken histories and thence model the possibility of doomsday. So my final point is that since the employment of broken history is necessary to represent what I'm calling present openness, and given that moment-based structures cannot have broken histories, it seems that, at least with respect to the possibility of doomsday, history-based structures in branching time have, let's say, one advantage over moment-based structures. So at least if we consider this specific aspect, there seems to be an advantage of history-based structures over moment-based. And that's it. So I hope I didn't take too much time. And yeah, if, of course, questions are more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Giacomo. So we have a question in chat. Anna Moiseva asks, can we rotate this branching structure to model the past that we do not know? If you consider certain situation and reason about possible states of affairs that may cause it, can we apply the same historical approach?
Yeah, I mean, okay, yeah. In the philosophy of time, let's say the standard, I mean, there are exceptions as usual, like Marcosian, but the standard is to say that, you know, if time branches, so that's a big if, obviously, but it branches only toward the future and not toward the past. But yeah, I mean, one could use branching structures to model our knowledge, actually, and it's done. To model our knowledge or our lack of knowledge, actually. So in this respect, yes, I mean, not a big expert, but I don't see any problem with, for instance, having a model where the branching, let's say, happens toward the past. And this will not be supposed, let's say, to represent reality, but rather our epistemic condition or our knowledge of the past, right? That might be incomplete, and therefore we might have different possibilities about how the past was, different epistemic possibilities. So thanks, Anna.
Okay, also Martin raised a hand, so please, Martin.
Yes, can you hear me, see me?
Yep.
Okay, good, thanks, Giacomo, for this. So I've got a question about the relation between completeness and openness. So for me, completeness is, you know, you've got a point M and any proposition is provable or negation is provable. Now we've got openness, which kind of introduce modality into the game. So what's the? I feel the tension there. So it's.
I see. Okay. Yeah, interesting. I would say that, okay, if you forget for a second about my case of Doomsday and present openness, I would say that in standard branching time, every moment is complete in the sense that you were referring to. So you look at any proposition, Socrates is sitting, or you know, either it's true or the negation is true, and so on. I would say this is true also of the openness with respect to the future. I mean, you look at a moment M, and it's either true or false that the future is open, let's say, with respect to whether Plato is sitting or not. I would say that everything is complete, usually in this sense. My point that I was trying to make is that in the case of the openness with respect to whether this moment is Doomsday, there seems to be some kind of indeterminacy within this very moment, M, let's say, because, well, it is indeterminate whether M is the last moment of time or not. So yeah, to use your, one of the points I was trying to make is that, yeah, to use your terminology, there is some incompleteness there in this sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Giacomo. And it's time to, we have another question from Konstantin, but please, only short question, because we also should proceed to the next talk.
Okay, then I'll say just my comments that Giacomo Andreoletti is not alone on talking about branching time. I will talk about branching time a little bit, so he's not alone. And then my question, I will address him personally via chat or email. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, looking forward.
Okay. So the next talk is from Martin Vacek, Slovak Academy of Sciences, and the title is Modal Realism, Incredulous, and Impossibility. Please, Martin.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. People, thank you so much for doing this. I know how hard time it is, and I was looking forward to travel to Russia, but unfortunately I couldn't. So, but again, thanks for doing this. I think it's worth of doing this. Okay, what I'm going to talk about is a kind of controversial topic, and it raises from modality. So let me just give you some short background about what's this talk is about. Probably you know about possible worlds terminology or possible world semantics. So that's kind of strategy that people like Kripke and David Lewis used to explain model claims. So it's true that Bratislava is the capital of Slovakia, but it's also true that Bratislava could be the capital of Czech Republic or something like that. So people introduced possible worlds as a way of kind of dealing with or explaining how model claims can be true, false, contingently true, necessarily true, and stuff like that. Of course, if you introduce this, you need to say something more about what's the identity of these entities are. People introduce possible worlds as sets of propositions, as sets of properties, or probably most controversial set of like concrete possible worlds. So what I'm going to talk about is a theory which says that possible worlds are concrete, real entities. They are spatio-temporally isolated from the actual world. The actual world is only one world, and there is infinitely many of possible worlds. It's called Modal realism. Okay. Of course, the objection is like, no, it's impossible. It's incredible to think about modality as something but the grounds, something spatio-temporally isolated from us. So the basic objection against that theory is like, it's impossible, right? It's incredible. No one can believe in such a theory. That's the objection. Another kind of phenomenon that shows up recently is the phenomenon of imaginative resistance. And here is a short story I'm gonna write for you. On one sunny day, two philosophers decided to have a cup of coffee. After a small argument as which coffee place to choose, one of them said, "Let the coin decide." It's my story, okay? So after they assigned heads and tails, the second philosopher flipped the coin and won. "The John's Coffee House it is," says he. They thus walked down the street toward the John's Coffee House, just realized that the place was closed. The first philosopher, angry of both losing and flipping and having no coffee, he has a sufficient reason to kill his colleague, and that was just the right thing to do. So the idea behind this story is like, it's a true story because I just created that story, but you're not gonna believe the conclusion, right? So there is something kind of mentally broken there, that the story is true because I just created a story, but you're not gonna believe the result, right? To kill someone for not having coffee is probably not what you're gonna believe, right? So you can read the story, you can understand the story, but there is something wrong, right? You're not gonna believe the conclusion of that story. Okay. And my idea is like, the incredulous stare against crazy metaphysical theory of possible worlds is nothing else but kind of imaginative resistance. So you're gonna understand the story, but you're not gonna kind of you're gonna resist that story or that theory might be true or might do some explanatory power when it comes to explaining model facts. Okay. One response to imaginative resistance is like, it's impossible, right? Such story can't happen because it's just impossible to believe in that story. It's impossible to flip the coin and to decide that I'm gonna kill that guy because the coffee shop is closed, right? So one explanation is that it's just impossible story, and that's what explains the imaginative resistance, right? The resistance is kind of backed up by impossibility. But I don't think so, actually. So one reason why stories which we resist to beliefs are possible, that we understand them, right? So we understand what's going on when two philosophers argue about where to go to coffee. They argue which coffee shop to choose, but we do understand that. So we do understand the story. We do understand what happened, why philosopher killed another philosopher because of lack of coffee. But it's not because it's impossible. It's possible because we understand that. So imaginary resistance is not explained by impossibility, right? So it's not because of impossibility that the story is resisted by us, right? There is something else. And let's run my analogy again. I mean, suppose you deny modal realism because it's impossible. It's not the case. I mean, there is plenty of cases in philosophy where we resist to believe that theories. You know, suppose you're Platonian and you talk to Aristotelian about what properties are. Aristotelian says there are universals, right? Platonian says no, there are universals of different kinds. Trope theories says no, there are tropes. Set theoretic theory says no, there are set of properties. And there is kind of resistance to believe, right? So if I'm Platonist, I don't believe Aristotelian, right? Because I just resist to believe that. If I'm Aristotelian, I resist to believe Platonian, right? Because there is something which just doesn't work, right? And I think the same stance goes towards modal realism. Okay. So the resistance against modal realism, or any theory, just read this as kind of meta-linguistic argument, right? Resistance towards modal realism is not based on the impossibility of modal realism, right? So if Incredulous stare is based on kind of impossibility, and if imaginative resistance is based on impossibility, and imaginative resistance fails on the impossibility basis, Incredulous stares against modal realism fails on the same basis. So again, so here's the argument again. We have a crazy theory about possible worlds, right? Let's call it modal realism. Again, the theory says that there is infinitely many concrete spatio-temporal isolated, entities. We have here a phenomenon of imaginative resistance. Again, that phenomenon says that there is something in stories which you just resist to believe, right? So I can ask you to believe that story. I can ask you to believe that to kill someone for lack of coffee is the right thing to do. That phenomenon can be kind of extended to other cases, right? I mean, moral cases are kind of strong ones, but you can extend that resistance to metaphysics, to logic, to epistemology, and you can kind of identify the same phenomenon in philosophy. So people can resist to believe in three-valued logic. People can resist to believe in monads. They can resist to believe in sets, stuff like that. So that phenomenon can be kind of identified in philosophy as well. And what I claim is that that very phenomenon is kind of directed towards modal realism as well. But if you go back to my first slide, people say modal realism is incredulous. It's impossible to believe in modal realism. But if you can explain imaginative resistance as something that's not based on impossible stuff, the very same thing can be applied to modal realism. And of course, you don't have to believe in modal realism, but you're not gonna believe in modal realism because it's impossible, as far as the analogy goes, right? So the question, how we know that modal realism is true? We don't know this, but we can't say it's impossible to believe in a possible world in modern realism if we apply that analogy between imaginative resistance and incredulous stare, right? So, of course, modern realism might be true, but it can't be denied on the basis that is impossible, right? If, impossibility denial against imaginative resistance applies, which I think implies, because again, we can resist some story to believe, but it might be perfectly consistent story. We might resist that, but not because it's impossible. And we might, incredibly stare against modern realism, but not because it's impossible. Just something else. I don't know what. Okay, so there is some mental machinery behind, but it's not based on inconsistency of that theory. So incredulity is not inconsistency. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have 18 minutes for Q&A. So any questions, please?
Giacomo, probably microphone.
Yeah, again. Yeah, thanks, Martin. It's really interesting. And I always liked modal realism, but I find it impossible to believe, even though I really like it. No, I mean, I really like the distinction between impossible simpliciter and impossible to believe. I'm not sure it's a question, but I don't know. I was thinking, suppose someone has like a patently wrong theory. Suppose I say, look, for me, knowledge is just belief. So S knows that P if and only if S believes that P, right? Some obviously wrong theory. Now, yeah, I agree. This is not impossible in a strict sense. Maybe it is possible in a very broad sense that knowledge just is belief. But it is impossible to believe because there are so many obvious counter-arguments to the idea that knowledge just is belief. So, I don't know. Yet, okay, to put it in form of a question, I mean, okay, suppose again, as I take it, you're a supporter of modal realism. I mean, to put it as a question, what counts here is, does it really matter whether it is possible or impossible simpliciter, or what matters most is that whether it is impossible or possible to believe? What is more important in your view?
Yeah, so the question is like, if we talk about epistemic impossibility and metaphysics impossibility, I mean, I was doing like very modest point, like modal realism is not metaphysically impossible, right? And if it's not metaphysically impossible, that might kind of mean that it's not even epistemically impossible. And if you buy this, I'm very happy with this. No more, right? So this is like a very modest point, like modal realism is not denied on kind of metaphysical basic, right? So that's the point, yes. A lot of work about like how to make it like justifiable, believable, stuff like that. Another work, right? But the point was like very modest to kind of analogically show that modal realism is not metaphysically impossible theory.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, as they can see, Konstantin also has a question. So Konstantin, please.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, thank you for your talk, and I have a few comments and maybe mostly comments. So it looks like that things like possibility, impossibility unavoidably has some sort of psychological stuff inside of it. Like, for example, it is normally absolutely impossible for an untrained brain that some number squared will be negative, right? Because we know from school that a times a, if it's positive, it is positive. It is negative, then negative times negative is positive again. So it looks like it is something impossible. Yet we can, everybody knows that we may give a little bit different interpretation. What does it mean to be a number, a vector interpretation, and that multiplication is not necessarily quantifiable multiplication. It could be a rotation. So something squared easily turns the direction of a vector, and I squared easily becomes -1, right? So we have to have some pattern of understanding that completely changes our view of a seemingly impossible things. So, well, history of scientific thought full of such revolutions in our intuitions, and particularly intuitions of possibility and impossibility. And it looks like it's a question of epistemic and understanding, I don't know how to explain it, revolution, some sort of inventing of a figure of understanding that will help to make it more plausible and more possible. I guess, well, that's my comment. What would you say on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. And of course, I'm doing like I'm building a huge bridge between like objective modality out there and kind of how we think about modality, right? So it opens kind of Kantian's way of like modalities category of the reason, stuff like that. Yes, I'm aware of kind of a huge bridge I'm doing now, right, between like how we think about modality and how modality is, right? Yeah, I think there is a lot of work about this, and to run that kind of analogy between how we think about modality and how modality is might be dangerous, but I still feel something in the air. Like, look, if we resist to believe some story, why do we resist believing in some theory about the world, right? So yes, a lot of work, lot of work there, but thanks for the question.
Also, Daniela raised a hand. So Daniela, your question, please.
Oh, thanks. So my question concerns perhaps a big point in the analogy, but I mean, I'm not 100% sure about that. But my worry is that if you consider the case of fiction and imaginative resistance, so the story you had there as an example, I think that we resist make-believing, and we resist taking it as a truth in fiction, at least part of the story. But in case of modal realism, people usually, well, that's how I understand it, they want more than make-believing and truth in fiction. They want real truth and real believing. So that's my sort of worry, whether we really have a good analogy between the two.
Yeah, so there is a chapter in David Lewis' book which simply says, no, people are not even like willing. Well, he's not using make-believing stuff, but they just deny the theory because it's not even possible to think about the truth. It's not like to believe in truth, but even like to pretend that such theory is true, right? So people say like, no, I mean, why are you kind of introducing that kind of theory, right? So in terms of believing, make-believing, probably I'm assuming that even like make-believing in a case of modern realism is not kind of accepted. in our company. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so any other questions?
May I?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, just a quick question with a little analogy with in this debate you might use with Müller-Lyer illusion, you know, with an arrow which is like this and with like opposite lines, and it is it firstly seems too impossible to believe that these lines are equal, but at the end it seems that it is actually the case, so it might be similar regarding modal realism, but it's firstly seems impossible to believe that it's true, but in fact it might be true. So in the like methodology which used to prove that lines are equal might be in a way kind of similar to methodology how you can prove modal realism is real. Yes.
Brilliant. Yes. Again, I mean, there's a lot of cases like, well, there are kind of two ways. I mean, we can believe in impossible, or we can't believe in possible, right? So I can believe that A and non-A is true. I mean, we have people who believe this, right? And it doesn't have to be the case that I believe some possibility, right? So it's logically possible that the laws of nature are, you know, upside down. It's possible, logically possible, but it's hard to believe, right? So, so yeah, there is plenty of cases like this. Like you can kind of run analogies about what we believe, you know, what's not possible, and what we don't believe, and it's possible, right? So, yeah, brilliant.
Okay, so again, any other questions? So looks like there are no other questions, so we proceed to the next talk. Well, the next talk is supposed to be presented by Pujani Ridas, but unfortunately she is absent at the moment. Probably she will join us a bit later. So the next talk is from Konstantin Pavlov-Pinus, Institute of Philosophy, Russian Academy of Sciences, and the title is Modeling Freedom, Rational Structure and Ontological Commitments. Please, Konstantin.
Yes, thank you. Well, it may sound ridiculous, but I will use pictures for the first time in my Zoom. So if something will not work, I will hope you will help me. Okay, I guess this one. Okay, is it visible?
Yep.
Okay, so I've changed a little bit my my basic theme, and I called my talk Virtual Ontologies and Autonomously Rational Behavior Towards Constructive Modeling of Free Behavior. So I will concentrate on the concept of virtual ontology and on autonomously rational behavior. Whoops. How should I move it? Okay. So I will introduce a concept of virtual ontology, and I would like to consider them as ontological commitment for two things: rational behavior in general and even free behavior. So the starting point for my considerations could be one of these, either algebraic systems or transition systems or label transition systems or universal machines. All of these are quite useful notations, but whatever point I will start from, I will necessarily modify them as significantly, so it doesn't matter which to start from. So I will start from an idea of an algebraic system, and then I will move to my virtual ontologies and more complicated objects. So I will recall what is algebraic system. Well, in fact, it's a pair consisting of two things. A usually is a set of objects, and sigma is a signature which consists of operations and relations. Operations or functions, relations could be called predicates. Well, and normally these operations and relations are defined to be deterministic, and that's enough for algebraical purposes. But I would like to dynamize this, and I would like to consider dynamical structures, so we will move in the direction of time parameterization and so forth. So what can we do here? First of all, I would like, besides deterministic regularities, introduce probabilistic regularities and enrich my signature with certain probabilistic regularities. I have no time for details, just some knowledge about probabilistic regularities will be enough. And besides that, my objects I would like to treat either as events sometimes or states. States would be better for these particular purposes. So that's the first step, but we need much more than that. First of all, we need to have some time parameter. Time could be linear, discrete, or continuous. It doesn't matter right now. For my purposes, it's enough to consider natural or integers, integer numbers. But in general, it could be a partially ordered set or a circular set or any other ordered set. There is no limitations on that. This is the one thing. One more thing is that our deterministic and probabilistic features has to be coherent somehow, because otherwise it's not that interesting. Like, say, psi function in quantum physics. On one hand, it is a deterministic function by itself, but its domain and it deals with probabilistic spectrum of outcomes. So this kind of coordination, coherence must be explicated in our signature. And now, instead of just one virtual ontology, one entity like this, we can consider the whole sequence of ontologies unfolding in time. It can be considered as one ontology unfolding or revealing its structure and deterministic and probabilistic features in time. So the next question asked is to what kind of patterns these type of sequences may follow. And there are several options. Less interesting cases are related to such patterns of unfolding in time of these sequences is when these patterns are fixed and external with respect to this sequence. It means that they could be a part of our signature, and they're fixed and they live there, and they have no effect on what's going on inside of this sequence. Actually, I would prefer to call these patterns of unfolding models of behavior. I will explain why I prefer this term a bit later. So models of behavior of such sequences could, the most interesting cases are when these models are variable and internal, not external. It means that they recursively depend somehow on the past of the future and even on forecasting abilities of these internal models. This is the first thing. One thing to be noted here is that parentheses here are not an accident, because if every instance like T0 or Tn has a probabilistic properties and the whole spectrum of possible states or outcomes, then it means that the whole sequence inside is in fact a whole scheme of sequences, not just one. It's a family of sequences. So if we introduce some sort of current time, then this family of sequence will be looking like this. First of all, there will appear a symmetry between the past and the future. One of the previous talks was exactly about this type of things. I will talk about it a little bit later, but right now I would like to concentrate on what kind of models of behavior could be and what kind of models would be necessary to consider for my purposes. So we can, later on we'll concentrate on models of rational behavior, but it could be models of deterministic or algorithmic behavior. Later on, I'll talk about models of free behavior as a very specific and highly sophisticated case of the first one, or models of some other types of behavior. This is the first thing why I prefer to talk about models, not just patterns. Secondly, models is something that generates a new type of causality. Model-mediated causality is exactly is what generated by models of rational behavior. Model-mediated causality and rational causality is the same thing, taking into account that we can explicate the internal structure of these models of rational behavior. Okay, everything fall down on my picture. Oh, okay. Another thing which is quite important for discussions around rationality and freedom is the fact that it is models that we use, the instances that force, so to say, our reality to be, say, deterministic or indeterministic, rational or irrational. Just, for example, think about economy. It could be planned, it could be market economy, but there is no such a thing as real economy. We may force economy to be deterministic or planned one. We may force economy to be indeterministic, and depending on how we use our resources, such properties and features of deterministic or indeterministic appear to be secondary with respect to more basic ontological features. And as opposed to determinism and indeterminism, it looks like that the word and the term virtuality is a much deeper ontological term, and it reflects a true ontological feature as opposed to conditional features such as determinacy or indeterminacy. And this is exactly why I prefer virtuality instead of determinacy and indeterminacy, and models instead of patterns. Okay, so here we have the branch in time. I have the most simple, the moment time, the moment-based model here, but it's just an example. So I agree that there could be different models of branch in time. So the actual history could be represented as a trace of actual outcomes of our unfolding in time system. And to the right of this picture, it is a possible or probable future that our model faces at current time t sub n. Well, that's just in order to visualize this a little bit. So let's go a little bit deeper inside of the question, what is a model of rational behavior? As I told before, there are many models of behavior. So model of rational behavior, as far as I understand, any model has three basic blocks, and everything what is called rational, from my point of view, has to have these three blocks. Otherwise, we're not talking about rationality, but about something else. So the first one is the past analyzer. The second one is the future forecaster. And the third block or module is the scheme that relates the forecasting capacities and past analyzing capacities. So again, we can visualize that this way. if we have a current time t sub n somewhere here, then our virtual ontology has to be such a thing that generates a process acting on the basis of its model MBT sub n, which has, on the one hand, an epistemic access to its own past, and on the other hand, it should have an epistemic access to its future. Well, normally it happens in the form of forecasting capacities. And what is important is that the epistemic access to the past should not be necessarily to the just actual trace of this system, because what matters not only the very fact that this trace was like this, but also the reasons of why this trace looks like this. It means that all previous history of decision making is relevant to how forecast the future. So it means that we have an epistemic access not only to actual history, but the whole spectrum of all possible events in the past. And the more rich is this information, the better forecasting capacities. Okay, so now let's take a look at the same thing from a bit different perspective. On this picture, I would like to visualize the relation between the different types of models of rational behavior, the 0 level, first level, and the second, highest level, with its dependence on the vertical axis stays for level of autonomy of our system. So this plane reflects all points on this planes are processes which are either rational inside of this area or extra rational outside of this area. And on the horizontal axis, there are very different types of virtual and not only virtual ontologies. So my claim is that, first of all those processes that lie below the horizon of autonomy are extra rational or irrational, because rationality requires some sort of autonomy of our processes. But not only that, to the left of this picture, all fatalistic or predeterministic or strongly deterministic ontologies, they are incompatible with rational processes. I do have some arguments for that, but not right now. And on the other extreme is chaotical or nearly chaotical and strongly indeterministic ontologies. They are incompatible with rational processes either. So the only area inside of this hat is something that can generate rational behavior, rational processing. This is exactly those virtual ontologies who are balanced good enough in terms of the deterministic and indeterministic properties and features. I call them weakly indeterministic or weakly deterministic, but it's better to call them just virtual. Okay, so why do we have 3 levels of rationality? Let's take a look at what do I mean here. Well, the 0 level is approximately a level of viruses, and it's in fact, it's hard to tell whether it's rational or rational processes. In fact, it is a borderline form of existence between alive and non-alive entities and rational or purely mechanical. So this 0 level is necessary to me just for the purposes to show that rational and extra rational properties exist, and there is quite fuzzy but localizable borderline between these 2 types of processes. So the most representative type of the first level rationality and corresponding models of rational behavior, well, just I'm kidding, kids and tigers are most representative figures here. So why do I'm talking about tigers and kids from algebraical point of view. From algebraical point of view, they are nearly the same creatures. So what is the first order modeling? Well, tigers has capacity of the first order modeling, and this means 3 things. First of all, they has to have an inborn, which is genetically coded model of being a tiger. Otherwise, it will never develop in a grown-up tiger. Secondly, it is absolutely necessary to have socially coded resources for improvement or revision of an initial model of being a tiger via learning games primarily. And thirdly, it is necessary, absolutely necessary, to have internal individual resources to interiorize these socially coded learning games and to develop its starting model of being a tiger. Otherwise, it will never become a grown-up. But there is a very important flaw, the thing is that first level rational processes and agents or actors, they have no epistemic access to improvement or revision processes. This happens mostly blindly. Okay, so, and this is exactly the borderline and this property between the first and the second level possibility to model rationality and rational processes. So the second order, well, I'm kidding, of course, from algebraical point of view, I'm talking about philosophers and cognitive scientists. Well, what's going on here is that the second level rational processes has a very powerful feature of modeling the very process of modeling. And the improvement or revision resources are part of this modeling of modeling. And this is exactly why, oops, I'm sorry. My battery is running out. Okay. So this second order capacity of modeling of processes of modeling brings into life an extraordinary variable possibility of behavior. And these type of creatures need not necessarily identify with any particular model of behavior. They may vary these models of behavior. And this is exactly why they have an ability to manage enormous forms of uncertainty. And this is the most interesting ability. So that was, so to say, formal part of my talk, and a little bit of text without formulas. So what do I mean by rationality, and particularly by autonomous rationality? Well, rationality is a purposeful behavior in the first place and a purposeful management of uncertainty, which is focused on reduction, or it's better, complete elimination of uncertainty. This type of behavior is, I think, should be called rational. Not everyone agree with me at this point, and I know, at least in Russian literature, who would not agree to this definition. But I have some arguments that this is the right definition for rationality. Otherwise, we don't need this rationality as a term. It could be reduced to some other like possibilities, like algorithmics or deterministic options. So the very fact that rationality is a purposeful management of uncertainty means that it has this phenomenon, this term has no sense in predeterministic worlds. It is impossible conceptually and ontologically there. So uncertainty has to be an ontological and epistemic feature of the world where rationality is possible. Okay, so one more thing is rationality assumes the possibility of autonomization of a given process. It was on my picture, but autonomy is not necessarily something pre-given. If a rational process just keeps its autonomy on the fixed level, then it is a zero or first level rationality at most. And the most interesting processes of rational processes are autonomously rational processes, or AR processes. It is exactly those whose increment of their autonomy is a result of their own rational activity. So this is the second order property, and I prefer to call it autonomously rational processes. And the dominant driving force of such autonomously rational processes is their own emerging recursive and self-reinforcing mechanisms and model-mediated mechanisms, rather than any pre-existing laws, rules, or mere spontaneity or randomness. So this altogether brings the picture of what rationality is, and particularly autonomous rationality. And these ideas explain why I have chosen that formalism that I've demonstrated before. So, and finally, a couple more considerations. Well, the one I would like to note that the third order modeling, in fact, does not add anything to the second order modeling. In fact, it's just a part of it. And it means that human rationality and human freedom are approximately at their possible maximum. It could be a little bit technically improved in terms of effectiveness, but conceptually they are at the maximum. And this is exactly what I was trying to picture on this picture. So second order rationality is the top. And and one more thing, which is not for this talk, but for my further considerations, is what is a free behavior. My talk was called Towards the Modeling of Free Behavior. Well, free behavior is a behavior determined, but not predetermined by a model of a free behavior. And models of free behavior is, it could be considered a submodel to speak more strictly, but it can be identified with a model of autonomously rational behavior, or second order rational process. So I guess I missed one slide, but well, my time is running out anyway. So thank you. That was my little talk.
Okay, Konstantin, thanks. So we have about 7 minutes for Q&A. Martin, please.
Yes. Good. Thank you very much. I'm afraid to pronounce your name, so it's Konstantin.
Konstantin, right?
Okay, Konstantin. Thanks for your talk. So I have a probably naive and probably stupid question. So the question is what ontology is. So here is my background, right? For me, ontology is you have a theory, translate it to, first order predicate, and you see what your quantifiers are quantifying over, right? So that's what ontology is for me. Now you've got virtual ontology, and what it is. I mean, is it something what exists, or is it something we pretend it exists?
Well, there are two sides of your question. Well, first of all, ontologies, if I do have some theory about something, say rationality or freedom, okay, so I need some truth makers for my phenomena, for my theory. So virtual ontologies are exactly those truth makers and necessary conditions for such things as rationality and freedom to exist. Okay, so on one hand, it appeared to be something theoretical too, but on another hand, it's something that should be independent on any theory, because ontology is something that refers to human independent existence. So it's a complicated question and a very good question. So in this sense, virtual ontologies, and by the way, to a big extent, it's close to your talk, because you was talking about possible worlds and more existence of modalities, and virtuality is approximately about the same matters. So from my perspective, virtuality is one of the basic ontological features of the world, independently whether theorize about it or not, because, well, because for many reasons.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Giacomo, please.
Thanks, Konstantin, for the talk. It was very interesting. I have actually a small question, suggestion. I don't know if you will find it useful. When you were talking about your model of rationality behavior, and you said, if I understood correctly, that in order to have, let's say, good forecasting capacities, right, we need epistemic access to the actual history, right? When you were showing the three, yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I mean, I agree. I was thinking that perhaps we need something more, which not only the epistemic access to the actual history, like how things actually went, but also to how things could have gone, right? So in the branching model that you were using, for instance, I think we should have some sort of epistemic access to, let's say, the past branches, you know, the branches that never became part of the actual history. Because, I mean, those are useful for, like, for instance, like yesterday was at the 6th floor and I had two options. I could take the stairs or jump out the window, right? Obviously, I took the stairs, but because I didn't want to die. But the point is that, let's say there was a possibility that I jumped out, right, that didn't actualize. The knowledge of this past possibility can, you know, inform my decision making and my rationality. And I know now it's rational to not jump. It's more rational, let's say, to take the stairs instead of jumping out the window. So yeah, that's this point that maybe we don't need only the actual history, but also the history that was not actualized. I mean, possibilities
yes.
that were not actualized. Mm-hmm.
This is exactly that I mentioned just with one sentence when I said that we need not only knowledge about the trajectory of actual past, but the reasons of why it was this, but rather than other. But it means that we have to access to all our decision processes, and particularly to those possibilities which did not come true.
Okay.
So the way we cut off possible outcomes of the world, and it's very informative. It is true. And definitely we need an access to our environment, but I included that into forecasting capacities. And at this point, one of the most interesting places exactly that you was talking about, the present indeterminacy. And my question actually to you was that, could we this indeterminacy at present and the present openness, right, as you said, treat as an ontological feature? And if it is ontological, then we may look inside of it. It's not a black box. We need to deal somehow with present uncertainty. And I have a lot of argues about whether it is possible or not to look at the present as something uncertain.
Yeah. I see. Yeah.
That we do. So.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay. Any other questions?
A quick one, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
What about counterfactuals? So I think we talk about counterfactuals all the time. Is there any story about like how to treat if, you know, A be the case, then B would be the case? And probably Giacomo's got has got this problem as well, how to treat counterfactuals.
I think it's a necessary part of forecasting facilities that humans are equipped with, because without counterfactuals and prognosing these type of things, it's hard to build up well-working models. So yeah, we necessarily have to take this into account. Maybe Giacomo will add something.
No, I mean, I think that's maybe it relates to my question. Yeah, if you like consider past histories, they somehow show how things could have gone counterfactually. So yeah, you can maybe just use that. Although not sure that technically would be the same thing, but.
Okay, so any other questions? So looks like there are no other questions, and since January doesn't show up, talks left, and again I'd like to thank you for joining us, for participating in our conference. Thank you, and hope to see you someday in person. So see you guys. Thanks and bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah.